I'm Teisha Bader, in for Mark Golub. And in the news, a delegation of the Union for Reform Judaism just spent about a week in Israel, meeting with both Israeli and Palestinian leaders, including with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem, and with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah, among others. Rabbi Rick Jacobs is president of the Union for Reform Judaism. He has been at the helm of the URJ since 2012, and prior to that, he led the Westchester Reform Temple in Scarsdale, New York, for nearly 2 decades. Rabbi Jacobs led the URJ leadership mission to Israel earlier this month, and he joins us now via Skype from his offices in New York. Welcome, Rabbi Jacobs. Thank you so much for speaking with us here on JBS.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. So when I looked at everywhere you went and everyone you met with and all the issues that you raised, I was honestly a bit overwhelmed just reading about it all. So before we get to the specific meetings you had, what is your overall feeling now after being back in the States for several days? How do you feel about the mission overall?
I feel great about the mission. Obviously, we were there at a complex moment. I don't know if there's ever been a moment that was not complex in the life of the Jewish state. It was incredibly important for our North American board leadership mission, not only to go and to see, but to share our insights and to gain a clear understanding of some of the incredible work that's going on the ground with our movement that's growing rapidly and with, I think, a remarkable just creativity and just a renaissance of Jewish involvement, Jewish learning, and, of course, the tough political issues that we face. But it was a moment to feel close to Israel, to feel the deep bonds, as well as to work harder on the things that are challenging.
Okay, so let's start with the meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Have you ever met with him before, Rabbi?
Many times.
Okay, so you covered a lot of ground in this meeting, and you called it in your press release candid. Many issues of concern that you spoke about with Netanyahu, including the U.S.-Israel relationship and the state of religious pluralism in Israel. How would you describe the conversations that you had?
Well, first of all, because we've met not only many times, but have been working closely with the Prime Minister and his team, it was a chance really to dive into some of the issues that we've been working on. For example, the Western Wall. We've been part of a small leadership group that's been working with the Prime Minister, trying to create, at long last, a pluralistic, egalitarian prayer space at the Western Wall. The Prime Minister led the government over a year ago to affirm 15-5 the creation of that pluralistic prayer space. It's been delayed because of some resistance within the ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel. So we had a chance to see where there might be some movement, and I was very, very gratified that Minister Tzachi Hanegbi, who the Prime Minister appointed to be the point person in the government to work on this issue, because it has been stuck. It's been at an impasse. Minister Negbi is the person that the Prime Minister greatly respects, as do we, who understands North American Jewry as well as the complex landscape of Israeli politics. So we got a chance to speak about where we might be able to see some progress there. It's not going to be simple, but I think Tzachi Hanegbi is going to be a person who could help resolve some of the difficulties and the impasse. But I also raised, because when I was there, I landed, and there was new legislation that was passed in the Knesset that very day that basically put a do not disturb sign for anybody who disagrees with the state of Israel. It was for those who support any kind of boycott, that they would simply not be allowed in the country. We have been fighting very hard against BDS. We continue to do so every day, but it feels as if that is not a good strategy, and I raised that with the Prime Minister. It was also the week that the Moazin law passed its first reading, which basically, Moazin is the call to worship for the Muslim community, and it was a first reading in the Knesset that would basically restrict the call that would go out to prayer in communities throughout Israel. That also felt very problematic in a country that celebrates religious freedom. So we raised tough issues. We talked about, frankly, the most important issue that we raised was the challenge to the bipartisan support for the state of Israel. That has been the most important part of Israel's security over decades. Democratic and Republican administrations have been rock solid, not just supporters, but deep allies and partners with the State of Israel. And no one and no administration can endanger that. That is just sacrosanct. And yet, it feels to me, especially on the eve of the AIPAC conference, that there really has been a shift, and that the notion that Democrats and Republicans can be strongly pro-Israel, to me, is a must, but it's being questioned right now, and I really pleaded with the Prime Minister to do everything in his power to affirm that bipartisan support. We also talked about the two-state solution, which has been a subject of much debate in the new Trump administration. We heard from Mahmoud Abbas that the Trump administration, this was the day before he spoke to President Trump, we heard that the administration had been in touch with the Palestinian Authority to suggest that it wasn't a one-state solution that they sought, but a two-state solution. That was reassuring. And the last issue, which was still very, very important, not least in importance, but one that we raised, was the question of the Jewish democratic core of Israel. That's always been the bedrock of the Jewish state. And it is, I think, fundamental to what the Jewish state is, that it be both Jewish and democratic. And anything that weakens that Jewish democratic state is something for, I think, all of us not only to be concerned about, but to prevent. And some of the recent legislation has, I think, called into question some of these democratic norms that must be preserved. So we talked about very substantive things. The Prime Minister was, as always, very thoughtful. We were very respectful. We appreciated his time. Obviously, he's facing many, challenges from within the country, but also internationally. And we had many members of his senior team. So it was not only candid, but I think it was a productive and constructive meeting.
So I actually want to talk more about several of those issues that you raised, but let's start with your meeting with Palestinian Authority President Abbas. As you mentioned, you went to the Mukata in Ramallah. Now, if you can give people a sense of what it was like just logistically to get there. I know if you've been to Israel, you know that nothing is really that far away geographically. However, Ramallah is actually very close to Jerusalem, but the perception is that it's kind of another world. And I'm just curious as to if it was difficult to get there logistically and actually what it was like being there, and if you have been to Ramallah before.
So the first answer is it's actually not far, as you know. We had been to the West Bank the day before our meeting with President Abbas, and we met with leaders of the settler community, and we were literally right next to Ramallah in the settlement of Sagot, which is near Beit El, it's near Eli. So it actually is in proximity, very close to major settlements on the West Bank. And frankly, it wasn't that difficult to go to either. Though to enter Ramallah, we entered. Obviously, we were a group of North Americans, and we entered with special permits to be able to do so because of our meeting with President Abbas. And I've been to Ramallah, several times before, and we drove freely through the city. It's bustling, and there are just not only businesses, but you can get a sense of the pulse of that particular city, which is in many ways the hub of Area A within the Palestinian Authority. And going into the Mukata, we went in. We were treated very, very respectfully by President Abbas and his staff and his team. I'll just also say that it was important for us to meet with leaders in all different areas. So the meeting with the settlers was very important, and frankly, Prime Minister Netanyahu was very appreciative that not only we met with President Abbas, but we also were able to speak some very, very serious concerns we have about not only statements, but also potential policy shifts of the Palestinian leadership. So we were there in, again, unofficial capacity, a chance to both to learn, to listen, and also to assert some very, very strong and important concerns I know the Jewish community writ large has, and the State of Israel as well.
So one of those concerns, I'm guessing, again, was mentioned in the press release, was about Palestinian incitement against Israel. How do you broach that subject with President Abbas. Was that difficult? Was he receptive to that? What was that conversation like?
Well, I'd say he was quite open in the meeting, and there was warmth and sense of welcome. And we talked about the things that were simpler to talk about. He shared in the opening minutes that he had, in fact, the word had been that there was no contact between the Trump administration and the Palestinian leadership. But in the opening moments of our meeting, he shared that no, there had been contact, and that it had been very reassuring to President Abbas that the new administration was not seeking to create a one-state solution, though the press conference that had taken place a few weeks earlier with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Washington seemed to suggest that that was on the table. When we raised the issue of incitement, it was clear that that was a major issue for all of us who love Israel and defend her every day. He had an answer. It was is one that he said there was obviously incitement in his mind on both sides. We pressed him fairly hard and said, the naming of squares within, Palestine after martyrs, after people who had, murdered innocent Israeli civilians, was not only a kind of incitement, was also a way to give honor to people who, frankly, were murderers. And, I said it very plainly. And, I think he heard the concerns. Obviously, it wasn't the first time he had heard the concern. And, he answered to the best of his ability. But he was pretty clear about their own narrative about issues and about the struggles that they have to believe that there still is a chance for a two-state solution.
So let's talk about that, those prospects for talks with Israel, the lack of progress, as you mentioned in your press release. You said that Abbas said that he was frustrated about the lack of progress and that you share those frustrations. So what do you attribute that lack of progress to? Are you putting the onus more on Israel? Are you saying that both sides have an equal share in why things have not progressed to this point? What are your thoughts?
Well, I would not try to put the percentage. I don't think it's the case that there's any one party that is entirely to blame. This has been, and I think the U.S. government hasn't been perfect in how it's tried to broker. Certainly, the attempt to move to the United Nations or to Paris and to other venues to resolve these longstanding conflicts is not advised. And I raised that with President Abbas. I said that in our mind, the United Nations has no credibility to resolve issues that include Israel, that it has been longstanding, and frankly, in its unfair treatment of Israel. And I think that one of the things that was very encouraging is that the day after we met with President Abbas, he spoke directly to President Trump. And then the very next week, Jason Greenblatt spent really the better part of a week meeting closely with Palestinian leadership, with settlers, with Israeli government officials. And to be honest, I was quite encouraged and said so publicly that this emissary of President Trump went and really wanted to bring some chance that he would not only come to understand better some of the complexity, but be able to position the new administration to work on these very challenging issues. So frankly, I think everyone has been frustrated. President Abbas, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very frustrated, and I think the U.S. administration certainly was not clear as to how to move in a constructive way. And listen, no one's going to do something in short order, but it's clearly a high priority of the new U.S. administration. And it's clear that they are trying to not just hear one side. I know that currently Israel has representatives who are in Washington working on the question of settlements, which was a major discussion that we had with President Abbas and also with Prime Minister Netanyahu. We had spent the afternoon seeing some of the really impressive settlements, not the suburban settlements, not the Ariel or the Gush Etzion block, but some of the settlements that, frankly, are really, thriving and are potentially going to be part of any two-state solution. And the whole question of will Israel ever, abandon some of those settlements is a real question. And certainly President Abbas wants to imagine if there's going to be a Palestinian state, that it's not just going to be a series of little islands within a larger geographic mass. And, the state of Israel is struggling right now whether to annex the settlement of Ma'ale Adumim and others. So the question of the settlements is a very, very serious issue. The reform movement, and the URJ in particular, for decades has been opposed to the ongoing proliferation of settlements. We want to be nuanced and clear about, which settlements in the blocks have always been part of the conversation about two states, that there would be land swaps. But it really seems that there is, in the current coalition in Israel, an ideology of the land of Israel and a real ideology of we can't give up any square inch of the West Bank, that it is part of the biblical land of Israel. And we believe that as we support the U.S. administrations for over 20 years and the current Israeli government, that the best way to resolve the conflict is that there be two states for two peoples, and that the Jewish state is, we yearn for that Jewish state for millennia. It is one of the sources of great pride to not only the Jewish community, but frankly, to those who admire democracy and the values that Israel stands for. But the current situation feels untenable, frankly, to everyone involved.
So let's talk about the settlement issue for a minute. It's a complex issue, but the question is that, in your mind, really what's undermining the two-state solution? Or is it, as Prime Minister Netanyahu maintains, the settlement issue will be worked out? That is not what is the impediment to peace talks or to the two-state solution, but rather the lack of recognition of the state of Israel by the part of the Palestinians. The Palestinians, of course, maintain that settlements are the major issue that are standing in the way of talks. It seems like a back and forth that's been going on for quite some time. So how do you respond to that? And do you see the settlements as, okay, this is a difficult issue that has to be ironed out during peace talks, worked on, or do you really see that it's the main impediment to progress?
Well, here's what I would say. For those who say it's not an impediment at all, and there are voices within the Israeli government who believe that deeply, I think that is naive. It clearly is a serious obstacle. It is not necessarily the main obstacle or the only obstacle, but it is a major obstacle to the forward motion of a peace process, because you're talking about sharing a very small piece of land, and frankly, the resources that go into supporting the settlements, both on a security basis and economically, not to mention how it chops up the potential integrity of a Palestinian state. So there's no doubt that it is an obstacle, but I would think it would be wrong, and we raised certainly the issue of incitement by Palestinians, the idea of training a next generation that doesn't think about coexistence with Israel, but thinks about violence. Those are major obstacles, and I'm not going to say that incitement is a minor obstacle. It's a major obstacle. And then the questions of the larger geopolitical and is the resolution going to be imposed by an outside party? I think it's pretty clear that there needs to be bilateral negotiation with the state of Israel. Palestinians, they are the direct parties to the conflict. They will be the parties to the solution that will be agreed upon. But this notion that just put settlements aside, just keep growing them, keep expanding them, keep creating new ones. The regularization bill that passed a couple of weeks ago basically allows the appropriation of private Palestinian land. I think if you're a person who's trying to see their way towards peace, there's no way you can make a case that settlements are not an obstacle. And I think the question is right now, Is there some government maybe whether it's a policy or even a plan to signal that the settlement enterprise is not the main thing to protect. The main thing to protect is the integrity and well-being of the state of Israel, and I think those are some pretty hard issues. But it would be naive to say the settlements are not a major obstacle, and it would be naive to say it's the only obstacle. There are many, and we're clear about the many, and most importantly, these are for the Israelis and the Palestinians to work out, not for third parties. But I think it's very important that the U.S. government, which has obviously a deep commitment to the state of Israel, militarily, morally, in terms of all of our core values, that the leadership of the United States is clearly required for there to be some forward motion. And we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu that his administration remains committed to the two-state solution, 2 states for 2 peoples. Very important to be clear about that language. But it's going to take quite a lot of effort, and it's going to take some backbone and leadership that, frankly, I think a lot of us have been hoping for from the leaders, but the risks are great. And, this is going to take a kind of leader that maybe is, kind of once in a generation on both sides, that's willing to not just talk, but to build concretely the steps that will build the trust that will lead to, the chances of not just sharing that little plot of land, but doing so with integrity. The Palestinians were pretty clear that this is going to be a demilitarized state. The Jordan Valley is going to be protected by the state of Israel. Israel appropriately does not feel there's any, international entity that can guarantee Israel's security. And I leave it to the Prime Minister and to the military to decide those questions. And we just went to first of all, voice that the overwhelmingly, Zionist American Jewish community obviously stands with Israel, but we also are able to, to raise questions and to want to be, in our own way, constructive.
Now, Rabbi, just going back, sorry, you said something about IDF training regarding coexistence or violence. I'm not sure what you said. I just wanted you to clarify if you meant IDF training or what you were talking about there.
Well, I wasn't talking about training. I just said that, a demilitarized Palestinian state is what Israel would demand, and,
right.
and it absolutely is not only supportable, but it's absolutely, I think, necessary. And the question of who will secure the eastern border of a Palestinian state along the Jordan Valley. Israel has maintained, I think appropriately, that it must be the military authority that maintains that border, because that's the border that, frankly, could be disastrous. So, I think that it's clear that the Israeli political and military establishment obviously is critical, but it is also the case that, I think currently some of the voices within the Israeli cabinet have made it clear that the settlements are never going to be abandoned, and even the new U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, had a chance to talk with him a few weeks back before his Senate confirmation hearings. He's somebody who has very deep love for the settlements. He has, in fact, specifically ties to Beit El, a settlement very near to Ramallah, the beautiful buildings that are in memory of his father, the late Rabbi Morris Friedman. So, there's a lot of feeling that there's, frankly, a pretty strong lobby for the settlements, and I think that we all, the Jewish people who love the state of Israel, want to be raising a question whether the settlements are the thing that must be protected. As I said earlier, the state of Israel must be protected. The chance for coexistence must be protected. And, I think settlements are there. They have been, as we know, not just the result of right-wing Israeli governments, but left-wing Israeli governments have encouraged settlement building. So it's not a left-right issue, but currently it is obviously the the deep conviction of some Israeli leaders that that nothing must lead to the abandonment of any settlements anywhere in the West Bank, and that simply feels to be a misordering of priorities.
So speaking of that, when you met with Jewish settlers during this trip, and you, I'm sure, expressed to them where you stand, where the URJ stands regarding settlements, that you support possible land swaps and some of those settlements under what you believe would potentially have to be evacuated. What was that conversation like with them? Did you feel you could speak freely about your position, and how did they respond?
First of all, were very warm, and we met with top leaderships of the settlement community, and frankly, it was a very honest, and it was also, frankly, a very respectful conversation. And we wanted to understand and to see the world and the communities that they live in through their eyes. This was an important, if you don't understand, if you're a North American Jewish leader and you don't understand what the settlements mean, not only to the settlers, but to, the Jewish people, you're not going to understand, frankly, the complexity and the challenges. So we went in ready to listen and to hear, and frankly, our time in Psagot was mostly a chance to hear the worldview and the assessment of settlement leaders with the current reality that they face. And, we were there to take that into our thinking and not to just go and meet with everybody who we already agree with, who, are part of our close circle of connection. I think the responsibility of a Jewish leader is to open yourself to the wider perspectives, and we did that, and I think it was very impactful on our leaders.
And I think, and that sort of goes with perhaps those who would argue and say, why did Jewish leaders meet with Abbas, for example? Peace is made not with our friends necessarily, which I think was said by Golda Meir, or I'm not sure which Israeli leader said, you make peace with your enemies. And it seems like you were trying to maintain that dialogue during this visit.
Oh, well, let me be really clear, because I hear people say, what was our delegation doing meeting with President Abbas? Prime Minister Netanyahu was pleased that we had the meeting. He was pleased that we articulated the concerns that we had. So I think it's important to know this was not some rogue mission that we were on. This was one that was very carefully constructed. We met with leadership across the spectrum in the Knesset. We spent a whole afternoon in the Knesset meeting with many leaders. We met with President Rivlin, and then we spent time in our congregations and with some of the leaders of our movement. So I think it's important to see the perspective and the diversity of meetings and the tone of those meetings. I think, for us as North American Jewish leaders to better understand the complexity and the possibility of this moment is critical, and that was ultimately the purpose of our mission, and I think we accomplished that.
Rabbi Jacobs, thank you so much for speaking with us today. We appreciate it very much and hope to speak to you. We will try and speak to you shortly again about some of the other issues that you addressed during this trip. Rabbi Rick Jacobs is president of the Union for Reform Judaism. He recently led a URJ leadership mission to Israel and met with Israeli and Palestinian leaders. We thank him, and we thank, as always, our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS Associate Director, Dara Golub, and to our editors, John McDevitt and Dennis Golan. I'm Teisha Bader, in for Mark Golub on this edition of In the News.